It is my real pleasure to introduce Professor Dame Muffy Calder. She's a prominent figure in computer science, recognized globally for her contributions to formal methods, modeling and verification of complex systems. She is a recipient of several prestigious awards and is celebrated not only for her research, but also for her dedication to teaching and mentoring students and to the broader computer science community. She has served as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Scottish Government. She was on the last two REF panels, quite impressive. And
last two.
She is currently a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, providing expert advice on scientific matters and promoting the integration of science into policy and decision-making. As Vice Principal and Head of the College of Science and Engineering at the University of Glasgow, she has demonstrated exceptional leadership, fostering a culture of innovation and excellence in research and education. She has an extensive portfolio of influential publications, and her work continues to shape the future of computer science, pushing the boundaries of what is possible with computational techniques, not least being a key co-investigator of the Responsible AI UK project. Professor Calder is a passionate advocate for increasing the participation and success of women in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, inspiring the next generation of women scientists and engineers. She was appointed Order of the British Empire, OBE, in 2011 for services to computer science, and Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, DBE, in 2020 for services to research and education. As far as I know, there are only 2 dames who are active academic researchers in computer science, and Muffy is one of them. So without further ado, Muffy, handing over to you.
That introduction deserves a round of applause. Thank you very much. That was very nice. Sorry, I'm just putting my watch here. Will you remind me, somebody, to take it away at the end? Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for organizing the people I saw this afternoon. I've had really interesting meetings and a very nice tour. You've got brilliant buildings here. So thank you very much. Right. What I'm going to talk about is modeling, computational modeling, but perhaps not as you have seen it. I'm going to reflect over the last 30-odd years. So it's not that kind of modeling, I'm sorry to say. It is about application-driven formal modeling. But in this area of computer science, I think a lot of people assume that modeling is at the design stage. It's about what you would like to build, and it's about reasoning about that. But I take a rather different view of modeling, and it's evolved over time. I think I need a drink of water. Do you mind if I just hop off the stage and grab something? Note to everyone, do not eat peanuts before you give a talk. So, the talk consists of, I'm going to go through 5 applications. I'm going to go rather quickly, which means that I'm not going to go into much detail. So I'm sorry for that, and you just have to take my word sometimes. On the other hand, it also means that hopefully you won't get too bored because there's always another application coming after it. So in each case, I'm going to look at what's the question, what are the techniques, and particularly what I want you to take away is the novelty and what I learned. So here's the 5 applications. I'm going to look at some protocol languages, signaling in biochemical networks, domestic network management, a mixed reality system, and user interaction styles. You could say from the sublime to the ridiculous. These applications are really quite different in terms of what they are, what sits behind them, but also the role of modeling in each is rather different as well. So as I said, the applications have changed over time, and so have I. So I'm going to start off with work that I did, started in the late 80s, into the early 90s. Probably a lot of you were not born. But this was a time, this is work with BT, this was a time when people were formalizing communication protocols. And it's really where my modeling career started. So it's about two ISO languages called ASN1 and ACT1. I don't expect you to know about ACT1. Anyone know ASN1? Oh, yes, yes. Wasn't it brilliant? Actually, it's still going, it's still going. Anyway, the question I was looking at is, and because BT asked me the question, what's the relationship or a translation between the two languages? Why? Because they wanted to integrate protocols and tools between both languages, right? So basically, they paid me to do this. And I thought, great. So what I did was, and I was alone in those days, I developed a denotational semantics of ASN1 in ACT1. And I'll just show you a very wee bit of it. So denotational semantics, it's basically you develop functions that take constructs in one language into another. Typically, you're carrying an environment, possibly a store. If you don't know what I'm talking about, doesn't matter. What matters is you got a load of functions and you define equation. There's one simple equation for something about sequences of integers, blah, 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 a structure in ASN1. What's important is I had to write 75 pages of equations. Then I discovered there are many more bits to ASN1. I also then produced 9 additional reports covering things like subtypes, functions, et cetera, et cetera. I was really proud of that. I just loved it. So what did I learn? I was fiercely faithful to ASN1 in all its peculiarities. It was deeply satisfying to write my own denotation of semantics. Typically, you know, you read someone else's of a programming language. I got to do it myself. I loved it. They were incredibly boring to read. Very tedious, I'll have to say, very boring. 75 pages of boring. When I presented this at a conference, Big 40 conference, someone from a telecoms company, now gone bust, anyway, said, we preferred it when everything was informal, and we could implement ASN1 any way we liked. And you probably still think that, don't you? Possibly. Anyway, lots of ASN1. Sorry, I shouldn't point. Anyway, what's really the point is I sent this off, my 75 pages and my 9 reports to BT, and you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I was devastated. So I thought, right, I'm going to show you. I implemented the semantics as an interpreter in Miranda. And then what happened? Everything. Well, first of all, I found a number of mistakes. Shock, horror. It's very easy to write black ink on a page, mathematics, and think you've done something really important and not understand there are mistakes, not being able to critique it and knowing that BT had uncovered the mistakes. As soon as I gave them the interpreter, everybody was using it. It all came alive and made a lot of impact. So this is the key lesson I got, is make your model come alive. Either be able to execute it in some way or be able to reason about it, and hopefully in an automated way. And this absolutely changed my academic career from here on. Every model I have built, I have been able to make it come alive, animate it, or execute it in some way. So that was example 1. That was quick, wasn't it? Right. Now, roll on about 10 years. And I was working with some medics in cancer research and cardiovascular medicine. The first of which, as you do, I met in a pub, and you have these conversations about what do you do, what do I do? And hearing what he did, it made me think, this sounds a lot like communicating systems. At that time, I worked a lot in process algebra. And he was working on what's known as intracellular pathways. So this is pathways within a cell. And here's the schematic. A signaling molecule comes and it hits a receptor on a cell wall, on the membrane. It then travels, a signal, it sends a message into the nucleus, which has an effect on the genes. But the key thing is the way in which it goes from here to there affects the effect. There's another question about how it got to there, which also affects, but I'm not looking, that's intercellular. So I'm looking at intracellular. So why model? Because they want to understand the interactions, the sensitivities, they want to test hypotheses, and they particularly want to study the effects of degradations. What's the whole point of this is when the pathway doesn't work as it's intended, and there's a fault. And so what they're particularly interested is developing drug interventions to get the pathway back into its the behavior it was. Here's a schematic of the pathways that I was looking at. This is developed by medics. The first thing I learned was, see, look what I'm doing, terrible. They use symbols and shapes however they like. I thought, oh, this is deeply significant that this is an oval and that's, you know, and it was like, no, it's just because he fancied drawing a circle there, or I learned all these things. They're just not rigorous like us. But there's a whole lot of deep stuff, but this is the main idea. There's a receptor, there's a cell membrane, and there's a way to get into the nucleus. But the more I understood this, I observed these are actually communicating processes. You can think of all these blobs here, these entities, these proteins, as processes. They are communicating with each other, and how they're communicating is through phosphorylation. It's the attachment of a phosphoryl group to a molecule. And where do you get that from is ATP. Do you remember ATP and ADP from your school biology? I remember my teacher saying ATP is the building block of life. Adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate. Basically, you're detaching these phosphoryl groups. And that is, in effect, signaling. When it's attached to the molecule, in a sense, it's switching it on. But the rate at which these things are taking place. So basically, there's underlying here is chemical reactions. That's important. So the techniques I use, the models were CTMCs, continuous time Markov chains, specified in stochastic process algebra. Underneath there, also, I used Prism Model Checker to encode those so I could do some reasoning using the temporal logic CSL. So what's really important here, though, in my abstraction, and this is, yeah, I thought, of course, I'm doing something really unique in the world, and then you find out everybody else is doing this at the same time. You know, it's always like this. There's lots of people looking at molecular processes, like Luca Cardelli. But the difference is they were looking at single molecules, whereas I have been looking at molar concentrations. So in epidemiological language, I was looking at populations and not individuals. And for me, that was something really quite new. I was also trying to have plug-and-play processes for assembling different networks. The whole thing is much more complicated than I'm showing you. For example, where the reaction is taking place also matters. There are these things called scaffolds, which essentially, if the molecules are sitting on the scaffolds, when they're all in place, then the reaction can occur at another rate, but that's another story. Let me show you a very simple bit of a pathway here. This is what's known as the MAP kinase pathway, RAF, MEK, ERK. Don't have time to tell you what they all stand for, which is just as well, because I can't remember. M is for mitogen. So on the left, phosphorylated RAF, which they draw with an asterisk sometimes, and sometimes with a dash PP. It phosphorylates MEK, turns it into MEK-PP, which turns it into ERK-PP. So we're getting closer to the nucleus. The question was, how does RKIP, which is the RAF kinase inhibitor protein, affect the pathway? So let's see this. Here is the schematic that I was given of this pathway. You see phosphorylated RAF up top, you see MEK, you see RKIP, you see some phosphorylated versions around here. So this is a diagram, right, given to me by the medic. There's the medic, Walter Koch. Great guy. He's very embarrassed by this photo. You ever meet him, don't tell him you saw the photo. So the circles are proteins. The squares are reactions. So proteins react with each other. Reactions can go forwards or backwards. They occur at a rate. So I wanted to make a process algebraic model of this. Let's look at a small portion here. The first observation is if proteins are processes, When can they engage in a reaction? Well, the simplest abstraction is to say, I have some molar concentration, or I have none. I've got high or low. So if RAF1 is high, what can it do? Well, if you follow these edges, you can see it can do a K1 reaction and turn into M3 following the edges out, or it can do a K12 reaction. So there we go. Using prefix, it can do K1, K1, and then become RAF low, because then it's low, or it can do the K12 and then become low. If it's low, then all you need to read off the picture here is the incoming edges. It can do a K5 product. It can do a K14. These are disassociations. It can do the forward ones. So there we go. So we can take every protein here and we can build up a set of equations. Another way to look at this is to say, instead of this being each protein as a process, I could say this pathway is made up of sub-processes. So here's a simple one. Take this one. I could start from 10. Pathway 10, I do the K9 reaction and then become pathway 11. Or I could start at pathway 11. I could either do K11 or I could do K10 and become pathway 10. You got that? Great. Right. Taking the first approach, I had 13 proteins, so I had 26 equations. If I just said they were high or low, I can make the abstraction more fine-grained. I can say there were 7 levels instead of 2. Or I can take the pathway, in which case there's only 5 equations. So it rather depends on what you want to do. The good thing is they're bisimilar. That means they're specifying exactly the same underlying CTMC. Remember, why did we want to do this? Because I want to look at sensitivities. So for example, I want to ask the question, what's the effect of binding RKEP to phosphorylated RAF on ERK-PP? And here, this graph shows you, this is what I get out of PRISM Model Checker, is the throughput, which is the rate times the probability, on Ka product. As I change K1 after an initial peak, you'll see that I am decreasing the throughput. So that says RKEP is dampening down this pathway, and that might be something that you wanted to do. So what did I learn? That's number 2 gone. What did I learn out of this? Well, the first is that reactions, chemical reactions, by the way, sitting behind here is an assumption of mass action kinetics and well-mixed mixtures. Of course, we don't always have that, so the whole thing gets more complicated when you have non-well-mixed mixtures, but we'll forget that. The point is, reactions are processes that we have to think about, am I thinking about individuals or populations as a process? And I was representing quantities. These were not notions I had ever thought of before in computing science. In computing, you tend to think of, you've got 5 machines in one router or 100. You don't have these, well, I didn't previously, hadn't looked at quantities, populations. Continuous time Markov chain models. Typically, the models in this field are all ODEs, or sometimes PDEs when space matters. I like to think it was my observation, it wasn't, it was my PhD student, Vlad Vyshemirsky, who one day said, Muffy, we're doing Euler's method. And he was absolutely right. That's exactly what we're doing. As you're increasing the number of levels, what you're doing, we were doing Euler's method for approximation. We've got some nice results that actually show this is what we did. I also developed propositions for quantitative trends, is something, growing or shrinking. But the real thing I wanted to get across is it really made me reflect on what's science and what's engineering. I'd always called myself a scientist. I then realized actually I'm an engineer, because engineers are thinking about something and then we build what it is that we wanted. But here I was looking at evolved system. We were like reverse engineering something that has been given to us, but now we want to engineer it. So I found the whole thing just so stimulating to think about the interplay between those two. Okay, I told you this is going to be fast. By the way, you can ask questions anytime. Number 3, back to computer science. Another 5 years on, I was involved in a project on home network management. This starts on the thesis that, by the way, Caitlin, this was with Tom Rodden. it starts from the original thesis that, you know, a PhD in computer science doesn't always help you set up your own home network. And moreover, a lot of people managing a home network, particularly in something like Tom and Mac's lives, where they have all sorts of machines and setup and children using them. Managers want to invoke policies, you know, you cannot connect to the internet after this time, or this machine can't talk to that machine during these hours, or, you know, various things like that. So that's the scenario. So you've got a very simple typically home network, laptop, router, internet, and, you know, a visitor comes to join your network. So the question is really underlying, you know, did it work? Did it work? Did the phone actually join the network? Were they allowed to? And what kind of policies have you got invoked at the moment? Are they being implemented correctly? You know, for example, did they allow access? So let's go through this one. This time the technique was about online models. A bit more about that in a minute. And why? The intention was to inform users about the state of the system. So again, not to design the system, but to actually, as the system is running, to help users to understand the state of the system, to detect and diagnose problems, and to check that policies are actually being complied with. So this is the key slide. Here's the conceptual idea. We have all the network traffic, you know, the laptop connecting out to the internet, the phone joining, etc., the router. We're going to capture all that network traffic in a stream database. We've also got policies that are being invoked and revoked. And so we're going to consider those in the stream database. And so we've got a whole stream of events that are happening in the system. And what I'm going to do is keep updating a model. So I've got a running model that models the state of the system at any time. And what I can do is I can do analysis on that at any time. And that is all going to be sitting on the router. Well, it was sitting on the router. And then we can give feedback both into the network and to the policy manager. So that's the basic schema. Now, the models here, so the model, we're modeling network events and access control policies. And the formalism we used was bi-graphs with sharing. And this is work that I did with Michele Sevignani. You'll hear his name again. He's really an expert in bi-graphs now. So what are bi-graphs? It's a sort of a universal process algebra that was developed by Robin Milner originally for space and time. Previously, process algebras were primarily for temporal evolution. This is also about spatial evolution. So it's not just about communication, but it's also where is the process. And the underlying it is just simple rewrite rules. Yay, they're all user-defined. Unlike most process algebras, which are predefined, here they're not. Another great thing is there's an algebraic form and a graphical form. And in the graphical form, you design all the graphics. And I'm just going to do it by graphical form today. So it'll look like it's cartoons, but actually it's not. And they all have full underlying semantics. To do analysis, compliance with the policy is just to check that the system, the model of the system, satisfies a property, and a property is just also a bigraph, so it ends up just being bigraph matching, which turns out to just be subgraph isomorphism. So the point is, after every model update, after every event, we're going to check whether the policy is complied or not. I looked at my watch again. Okay, here's a bit of cartoonery. Here's a picture how we would draw a machine and a router. Both have signals, and they're in the intersection of the two signals. The bigraph looks very, very similar. So it's my choice, our choice, to represent entities, the machine and the router, by circles, and their signals by circles. The green edges denote communication between processes. The spatial things denote the topological relationships. And the first thing that we did is we had to redesign bigraphs to actually allow intersecting areas because Robin had designed it based on trees, so we had to turn them into graphs to allow this overlap, because he had been thinking of physical space where you don't have the notion of overlap, but of course when you go into radio waves, of course you've got overlaps. So here, the idea, R and M are linked by signals, R can sense by bits of each other's, and R and M are linked so they can communicate. Okay, here's a schematic of two machines and a router. Here's the equivalent bar graph. Again, looks pretty similar. How do you evolve a bar graph? We have rules. So here's a rule that says we can add a machine. So here's a generic bar graph on the left. This is where we're not going into details. I'm doing this very fast. You can read all the papers, you can get into bar graphs, so hopefully you get the idea. On the left, we have an arbitrary bar graph. The shaded out region is just an abstraction, and over the right is we have actually brought in M. We can remove a machine, so here's a rule to remove a machine. You apply it to this graph, and lo and behold, you've removed the machine. I'm just trying to give you an idea of rewrite rules. And policies are also rewrite rules. We say we have this arbitrary bar graph. We can now rewrite to that bar graph, which just says all the traffic from www, we can't connect that to the laptop. So what was the point of this? Remember that we were doing this on the router in real time, and I just thought I'd show you some of the results. Basically, we can do it very fast. This was up to 30 machines. And we didn't notice. Well, certainly the users didn't notice. So what did I learn out of this one? Well, the first thing is we call these online models. You may call them digital twins now. Digital twins have been around for it's a model that was an up-to-date reflection of the state of the system. It's just everyone thinks digital twins are differential equations. They're not. Or they think they're spreadsheets. Anyway, bar graphs with sharing, with overlapping spaces. Michaela has developed a really nice tool called bar graph ER. So if you're ever interested in bar graphs, go use that tool. There's no need for temporal logics here. I thought there was. I went into it all ready to do temporal logics. Everything was about state predicates, which is just bar graph matching, which we implemented in a SAT solver. What we did find, I'm not showing you here, is that policies, of course, interfere with each other, don't interwork all the time in unanticipated ways, and this allowed us to find that out. Okay, 2 left. How are you doing? No questions yet. Is that bad or good? I might slow down a bit more because the last 2 are a bit more complicated. So this is about something called the Savannah game. Caitlin, this is the game. Tom Rodden. This is about a game developed by Tom Rodden and Steve Benford. It's fascinating mixed reality game. It actually predates Pokemon Go, and I think it's much more sophisticated than Pokemon Go. What we have here is notions of location, space, time, sensing, and cognition. So let me try and explain this. So the idea was there is a virtual savanna. A savanna is a place that has, tall grass, it has water, it has sand. Think of an African savanna where there are animals, okay? Lots of different kinds of terrain. And this savanna is actually going to be, so that's in the digital computational world, and it's going to be laid out on the physical world on a football pitch. The players are instrumented, they have GPS and they have personal digital assistants. The players in the game are lions, and lions can be in locales. Locale is a savanna concept. Are you in the grass, are you in water, are you near to this or that? The lions in the game can see nearby animals. I will restrict it here simply to other lions and impalas. And I'm afraid they attack the impalas and eat them. They can also drink, etc. Now, I was not involved in the design of the game. Here's some actual shots. Here's the computational world. Here's what it looks like. You're in the game. Here's your PDA. And there's some players on a pitch actually playing it. Now, the game is just a wee bit more interesting. You don't, as a player, kill an impala on your own. You have to go into groups of 3 players to hunt down and kill an impala, but you need to form that group in the physical world to make it in the computational world. Did you get that? Now, they did some user trials, and during it, they found this scenario. These are photographs taken from the real user trials, where these 3 girls, who do have real names, but I'm not going to reveal them, I'm going to call them X, Y, and Z. These 3 girls ended up being very confused at one point and kind of lost in the game. And we called this the 3 girls, a boy, and an impala problem. There is the boy. Okay, so they had this problem with the game. They couldn't understand what happened. So what do? You call in a modeler, and they said, Muffy and Michaela, come and tell us what's happened. Why is there cognitive dissonance in our players? What is wrong with the design of this game such that people are having this trouble? So we thought, right, we're going to use bigraphs because we've got space and time evolving here. We have bigraph predicates for reasoning. We've got nice graphical notation. And the key observation right at the beginning is we're going to do this by, instead of trying to model the game as one lump, we're going to break it down into 4 different design perspectives. That was the very key way to start this. So here's the 4 perspectives. It was also the only way I could understand this frigging game. It's so complicated. So you have the computational world. There's the savannah. You have the humans. You have the technology, the GPS sensors. You have the physical place where they're doing it. And the humans can have social interactions with each other. So they said, do you remember Pokemon Go? Yeah. You get in the flavor of it, right? I'm now going to describe some of the biographical model with using our graphics. So we make much richer diagrams now, but these are just entities. They could be circles, they could be X's and Y's. Underlying here is full algebraic stuff. So let's start off in the bottom, the computational world. The key thing is that we have lions, we have impalas, and they're in locales, and we have the rules, biograph rules that tell us how they eat, they drink, and they hunt. So here's a rule that says we also, not only can we use shapes, we can use colors. This is really nice for typing. So an ordinary lion, there we are, a lion that has seen an impala and in a sense locked eyes on it, you see they're communicating, now turns yellow, the impala turns yellow, and they're now communicating. So this can go forwards and backwards, this rule. You got that? Good. Physical world. The players are on a field, so this is where we pair the player with a lion. And what can a player do? Can initiate attack or in a group. And again, we use colors there to denote whether you're in a group or not. I think yellow is you're not in a group, and blue is you're in a group. Okay, remember, so there's a rule that introduces a player to a lion, pairs a player and a lion. The technology world, relatively simple. Basically, we are on a Cartesian plane. We only did it in 2 dimensions, so you have your XY coordinates, basically your GPS positions. What you can do is you can enter a game and you can move. What's the key word here is that you have areas. If I just go back a bit, a key word here is locales are a computational concept and areas are a technology concept. And then the last is humans. So here I learned a whole new field of proxemics. I didn't know it existed before. It's about the theory of social interaction. And we have rules of basically personal space. And there's a concept called aura. And if you're in the same, if 2 individuals are in the same aura, they can communicate. An easy way to think of that is just like they might be able to see each other or hear each other speak. They can communicate. And what we have is embedded auras. So that's an aura over there. The rule says, right, oops. There's two players in separate auras and they move into the same overlapping aura. You got that? Great. So what we did is we took the log of the game for the 3 girls, a boy, and an impala problem. And then we looked at the biographical model for each of those states. So I'm going to run through this now. So we start at state 0. I've combined human and physical to make it a bit easier here. So here's the human physical, there's the computational, there's the technology. So we start off, we have 3 girls, X, Y, and Z. They're in a shared aura. X is in a locale up there, mapped onto area A. The others, Y and Z, are mapped to lions in A dashed. You got that, right? Aura, locale, area. Next state, Y enters the same locale, so goes up as X and the impala. State 2, Z enters the same locale as the other 2 girls and the impala. So all the girls are now in the same locale as the impala, right? Any girl could initiate an attack. And just after that, Y's GPS drifts out of the locale. So she's back down there. She actually doesn't realize this, and that's the whole beauty of technology and sensing. Now the boy enters the locale. So there you see the boy's lion up there. The boy has entered the locale, but he's not in the shared aura. The girls don't know he is there. There he is. The boy sees the impala and initiates a kill. There we go. X joins the kill group. She thinks she's initiated the kill. She hasn't. Gave away. Z joins the group. The 3 children are now in the attack group, except they're not all girls. You got that? Next one, the impala is killed and disappears. The boy leaves, exit left, and Y is out here hungry and confused. So Y thinks they were part of the attack group, but they weren't, because they weren't in the locale. So the problem is in this state, X and Z are in the same locale, but not in the same aura, and the girls are unaware of the boy. Now, we actually showed that was, well, it happens to be the cause of this problem. It is a problem in the design, because what we did was we then went pairwise around every design perspective and looked at theorems about that. And you will see the theorem that you would expect, if A and B are in different auras, they are in different areas. And that is not true, whereas it is true for all the other pairs of perspectives. So that explains that design fault, and it's something the designers were totally unaware of when they had designed it. So what did I learn? Bigraphs, powerful graphical notation for communication with the engineers, because they actually really understood this. Funnily enough, they didn't like all the pages of the algebra. Having the 4 perspectives was a really big insight. But the real thing is, this is about modeling for the analysis of something that happened. It's about taking actual behavior, logged systems, and replaying it and trying to understand. So it's not about for design, but it's for actual use. And now, finally, how are you doing? We're entering number 5. So this is about user interaction styles. By the way, prior to the Savannah game, I had never done anything that involved human users. And I was always steadfastly against anything to do with pesky humans. But after I met Tom, he sort of changed my view about, human-computer interaction a bit. And I suppose I just matured a little when I realized that, socio-technical systems and all that, humans do use systems, maybe, there's only so much you can do with communications protocols. So the question here is, how do users actually interact with an app, and can you redesign it to suit different styles? So bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it. The techniques are, in this case, in the last case, we had a log of one system behavior. Here we're going to log interactions over hundreds and thousands of users and look at their state change, the way they change the state in an app. We can segment all those, so that's time series data into days, weeks, months, etc. We are then going to infer models, admixture models from these. They happen to be autoregressive hierarchical Markov models. And then we're going to analyze them with temporal logic properties. So I'm going to show you how to do this by application to an app, which again, I did not develop. The designers came to us, and this is work. Caitlin, you know everybody I've worked with. This is with Oana. So App Tracker is an app for personal informatics that allows you to track how you use other apps. This is all meta, so it's an app to allow you to study how you use other apps like Facebook and blah, blah, blah. It runs in the background, and you get all these charts and statistics about what you've been doing, etc. The point is, there's a huge user community. There's over 35,000 downloads. Now, what we did is all ethically fine, they agreed to this. We would collect their traces over time. So schematically, I've just used colors to denote some states, okay? So for each user, you have a long trace, which you can then divide up into days, which then becomes months and years if you are foolish enough to run an experiment for that length of time. What we're going to do from these traces is infer what we call activity patterns. Here's an activity pattern. It's a discrete time Markov chain. And what it says is it tells you the probability when you're in a blue state to move to a green state or to a yellow state. That's been inferred from these traces. I'm using a thick line to denote high probability, thinner to denote lower probability. But it's not just, you don't just from these traces infer one discrete time Markov chain. We can infer many of them, depending on how many we ask for, and then you can move in between them. So the key is they have the same states but different underlying probabilities, and a mistaken arrow there that I have no idea what that's there for. Sorry about that. So at any time, you can stay in this activity pattern, or you can move into another one, or you move within it. You got that? Great. You might ask, why on earth would you move in between activity patterns? You think a style. Well, you haven't used the app for a while, so you change your style. You're tired, you're fed up. You want to explore the app, or you know exactly what you want to do, or you're on a train. And I mean, there's whole loads of reasons. We don't know. I'm not trying to capture that. All I'm trying to capture, I'm observing the style has changed. If you're interested, technically, we use, it's EM algorithm, expectation maximization. So these are, as I said, first order autoregressive hierarchical hidden Markov models. H is for hierarchical, not hidden, sorry. So then we can look at properties within an activity pattern. So we can refer to variable y in a pattern, and we call that a single activity pattern. There's an example using pctl star, if you care about that. Or we can have properties over activities between patterns, so this can get quite complicated. There we go. This is the property that says, if I'm in the state J in pattern 1, what's the likelihood that this leads to the change to a different, or is it the same state in pattern 2? You got that? So what's the probability to move in between these? Because sometimes you might expect a state, or indeed a computation path, is almost like a trigger to change patterns. Now, to make this a bit concrete, in App Tracker, there are 16 high-level observable states. That's not an activity pattern. That is the underlying state diagram. Remember, someone had designed the system. We know they designed it. We know the designers. Here are 3 example activity patterns. If I said I want 3, there's examples and you would move in between them. But remember, these change over time. Many dimensions going on here. So if I just took the second one, I can look at it in the first month, the second month, or the third month. You see the probabilities change. For example, between the first, these are real, by the way, first and second month, there's the probability of moving between 5 and 6 is very high in the first month, but not at all in the second month. But how do I characterize what these graphs are telling us? Is I take all my temporal properties, of which I had many, many, many parameterized properties, I instantiate them all, I look at the probabilities, and here, when I just have 2, you can very easily see they almost, the temporal logic properties allow us to distinguish these patterns really nicely. They're either the properties give us a probability, like as in visit prob int, or it gives you actually a number of steps in a computation. As I said, I'm going through this very fast. So you've memorized that. What it does is it's told us something about the different patterns. I can then classify them depending on the probabilities of the properties, the states involved, and the lengths of sessions. I also know how long someone was in the app in a particular session. We did make the assumption and a session never went over 24 hours. In this case, with k equals 2, there's 6 possible combinations, only 4 were observed. So, by the way, we're doing science gain on an engineered system. So, in terms of what we got there, you can see there's quite a difference. These names do denote behavior. For example, you're glancing at specific states or you're browsing over summary kind of states. The key thing is in the early days, that's 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, we saw 2 different styles. Second month, third month, different styles. Then we wanted to look at what's the probability to move in between the styles. Here's graphics showing that. And again, it's the same. So in the first day, first week, first month, you have very high probabilities of moving in between the patterns. In the second and third month, very low probability to move in between the patterns. So summarizing, we saw a lot of browsing in early day, well, quelle surprise, and focusing and glancing in experienced usage. So what we did was we redesigned the app to support focusing and glancing styles. So to summarize, we went back in, there's the original state diagram up top, and we moved states around. How these states are presented, they're presented in menus to the user. And so we changed things to make some things more easily accessible, and some things to make it harder. So here's App Tracker 2, based on supporting those styles. So what we did, App Tracker 2, we released this out into the community of these 35,000, you know. We waited, I think it was 6 months. We gathered in all the logs. We did all the inference of the models. We did all the I say we, actually, Oana did nearly all of this. Bless her soul. It's a lot of analysis. And we end up with, by the way, we did this for k equals 2 up to 7. The probability to change activity pattern in the original app tracker, remember, it was very high in the first month, up to the first month. In the new app tracker 2, it's very unlikely for all the time periods. So we concluded that's very strong evidence to say, with the lower probability, that we have actually achieved our goals. We have redesigned for how people actually want to use the system. The key is, we didn't change the states available, it was just how many steps. We changed the computation paths that were easier to take through the system. A few things to note. So this is sensitive to observable states, how you segmented it, the number of patterns, the inference algorithms, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I forgot to say, of course, this is machine learning, unsupervised machine learning. I had to mention it somewhere in this talk. There we did, AI, right, done. A couple of observations. So we were not running these experiments over just a couple of days with a few students. We were actually doing this out in the wild through the App Store. But we had to use jailbroken devices. And that actually does bias your users. Jailbroken devices, I would say, are usually used by young men. Certainly I wouldn't have one. The next problem is when we released App Tracker again, this is a real problem. App Store wouldn't allow us to link to existing installations. So we have no way of knowing anything about the population in this, whether they were existing users or new users, which is really quite a problem. So I'm nearly finished, don't worry. What we did is models of actual behaviors, not design, but how people actually did use a system. Unsupervised machine learning, again, just to remind you. Real-world deployments, you have to be very aware of the bias of this, existing users or not. Breaking up the data set was really important and something we actually hadn't thought of before we started our experiment at all. We just thought we'll just take the time series up, for the first 10 months. How naive, but hadn't thought of that. So all these things I learned. Experiments can take a very long time. So this is over about 5 years. The whole final paper was rejected by TOSEM because they didn't like our experimental design. They think we should have asked users for some commentary about what they were, why they were doing what they were doing. But we hadn't, and we couldn't go back 5 years. I'm really annoyed with them. And anyway, because I think, there you go. It's all available on archive. But the key thing is we were using models to inform redesign, not the original design, but redesign. So 5 examples. The red just highlights I think the new things for me that I got out of each of them. There's a whole shed load over the last 30 years. I've done so many more. I didn't mention them. Recently, we've done a lot of work on BDI agents in bigraphs. More protocols you could shake a stick at. Medical devices, service failures. We looked at telecommunication systems failures. And I once did the most ridiculous thing. I made a probabilistic model in Prism of War and Peace, well, an abridged version of War and Peace, and looked at if the question was, if Napoleon had marched on Moscow more quickly, what was the probability of Pierre marrying Helene? Ridiculous, but kind of fun. I just thought I'd mention it. So recurring themes. Theory is always challenged by applications. My own development of theory, what we did with biographs, has been so much richer because of applications. We would not have thought about, for example, over these different topologies if we hadn't had an example that drove it. The reasoning tools have just improved greatly over time. My models, I have become much more stochastic, online, even human in the system, and very much interested in replay and revealing behavior in the wild. In every single model ever developed, I would say interactions and interworkings issues are just everywhere, from biological pathways to usage styles to policies. The future, models are for much more than design. That's really the key message. I think it's very much for online decision support. Models of designed processes can be very much informed by data. So I'm not just interested in inferring a model, but given a model of something we designed, and now what can I infer about its use and change that? So it's maybe just a bit more subtle. There's a whole area of maintenance, ownership, and documentation of models, rather, the software engineering of the model ecosystem. And the final message is something I knew all along, and I'm sure you do as well. It's not actually always the model that matters, it's the modeling process, it's the whole thought process that you went through to do this. So that is my finish, and I just wanted to put up names of lots of people that I've worked with over the years. I mentioned Oana and Michaela have done an awful lot of the work in the last 2. So thank you to them, and thank you to you. I was a bit long.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a few questions.
This is, oh yeah, please.
Thanks, I really enjoyed the talk. So one of the themes that I found really interesting that was coming up is how formalism meets usability. So you mentioned at one point that you shied away from being involved with messy humans, but in a lot of the things you did, actually, humans were involved in some way. So my impression is that when this works well, it's kind of accident. Like with bigraphs, the fact that humans could work with them, I don't know whether Robin was coming up with formalism with a view to ordinary people being able to express their home network configuration in terms of bigraphs. So I wondered if you had any sort of wisdom on how to make these two things meet. Often they don't mesh very well. They're making formalisms that humans, ordinary humans, can work with.
So one thing is, certainly the graphical form of bigraphs really helps you to explain. Another thing I mentioned, we were discussing earlier, when there are probabilistic outcomes, when your outputs, so somehow the result of whatever reasoning you did is probabilistic, that it's not that it's difficult to convey probability to somebody. What's difficult to convey is what they should do with it. And that is the problem I'm continually hitting, is how should that inform the next decision that you make? So what we were doing when we were redesigning the system, what I didn't show you there is there's a whole lot of deep probability stuff about, and we could put more weight on the fact that focusing was, above 75%. And we made judgments, but the real question is, how do you reveal, how do you explain that? I'm not giving you a good answer. What I will continue to say, though, is never try to model intention. I think that's a bad idea. I did for a while do works on, what's it called, logics with intention, and failures, very complex logics. And I soon gave that up because basically you're always in exceptions. You fall out of the normal world almost immediately. Any system is degraded almost instantly. So you might as well just recognize that from the beginning. But try to not try to think about why, but model what has happened and then go back and look over it. Does that help? Thanks.
Other question? Carmine?
Yeah, mine is very much down to earth. In the app tracking example, why can you assume that users are Markovian?
Why do
you assume that users are Markovian, right? So you define these Markov chains, but it's not entirely clear that they are.
Yep, thought about that. But how many steps back do you want to go?
Yeah, that's the problem, right? But it's about modeling, and it's always a challenge. So you're making an assumption, of course, but yeah. I wonder whether you had any evidence that they were Markovian, or you just went with Markovian?
Well, in a sense, there is, if you really dive into it. So we didn't just, because we're not just looking at one steps, we do look at paths. So the temporal logic properties are reasoning over paths. So that's kind of my get out clause. This is where we are not just looking at the single probabilities. That's what the temporal logic gives you, is it's an exploration. And it all depends on the quality of those properties. And we spent a long time developing what those properties should be. The really interesting ones are the properties, not that you moved around in here, but you moved around here and you went over there and they just got we did come up with increasingly complex ones and more clusters, because that's basically clustering. And at least for that system, there's really no point going above 3. Doesn't tell you anything more. And probably looking at computation paths longer than about 7 doesn't tell you much either. But, sorry, you hit the nail on the head. But it was also, could we find the simplest model that tells us something?
Thanks.
Other question? Maribel?
talk. It was fantastic. I just have a quick question, I think. You mentioned several components in your models, in all of them, basically. The description of the state, the description of how this state changes with the different transformation rules. You showed us some of the rules on by graphs. And I was wondering whether at some point also you looked into the control for those transformations. I'm thinking because in Porgy, for example, we rely a lot on strategies that would define in which way the transformation rules apply, in which way is like the control for the evolution of the system. It might be different ways for it to evolve. Did it play a role in your models?
Not in these are all distributed systems. There is no control. That's the whole thing about game, that there is none. Interesting, the motivation for the app tracker work was originally to capture behavior of successful users of a system. What is their strategy? And to try and then make that available to other people. That's actually what we were looking for. And then, and we did do another model of a game called Yoshi. I don't know if you've heard of it. Yoshi eats fruit and, and gets so many points for, blah, 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 and trades money. And yeah, it's all this stuff about strategy. But what we found was, it was very difficult to uncover those. In these distributed systems, if you don't have an explicit control, no.
Sometimes it's just trying to discover it.
Like in a sense.
In your system, you might observe that the distributed system evolved in a way, and so which were the transformations that took the system to... Okay, but
in a way, it's coming back to your question, which is it's these capturing the styles, which has to do with what are the properties that we were looking for. So we could have, in the temporal logic, tried to express a property that more captured that notion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a question here at the front.
Can I say you're a very knowledgeable audience? These are good questions.
This isn't a very technical question. But
So is or is not?
It isn't.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you know when you're ready to take on a project, and how do you know when a project is worth being taken on?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, do I get fascinated by the problem? Can I get into, in each case, so this is classic interdisciplinary work. It takes a long time to understand the problem. So you have to be dedicated, you have to decide, I want to do this, because it's going to be at least 6 months before you understand what it is. The next thing is, whoever, let's call them the client, the project owner, can they articulate the question? I think I forgot to say it up there. In nearly all these cases, it was really hard to get the question from the problem owner. What is it that they wanted? At least with the game, it says, tell us why it doesn't work. But it's really hard to get the question from them. And if they can't articulate the question so that that you don't know how to solve it, because if you know how to solve it, then it's kind of boring. I'm serious. That's a reason not to take it on, because oftentimes I've realized what someone's asking me for is basically they want a big Excel spreadsheet, and they just want to compute some probabilities over it. Do you know what I mean? That there isn't, is there an aspect of communication? Is there something dynamic? Is the system changing over time? And it all ends up kind of, do I like the person as well? And so I think what's really important, the photograph I showed you of Walter Koch, who is a world-renowned cancer specialist. He's a lot of medics I talked to, I just couldn't really they just talked about databases and genes. Sorry, I couldn't connect. I really connected with Walter. Turns out he was Austrian chess champion, age 13. He thinks really algorithmically. He could talk about process and almost procedure. He could talk to me in a way that I could understand what his problem was. And I think that, for me, makes a lot of difference. Thank you. Does that answer your question? But I have walked away from a few when I realized it's not floating my boat. Or I'm not, and subsequently, I'm not going to give them anything good either.
A final question? I will ask a final question. Responsible AI.
Yeah.
So where does it fit in your view of the world, and how can you adopt your methodology to try and tackle some of the challenges in that context?
So one of the reasons, well, I like to think I'm responsible in everything I do with science. So of course, no, I'm serious. That attracts me a lot. The actual work on inference in this last example, by the way, I did inductive inference in 1991, I think. So I actually did some learning of functions way back when, these mathematical functions and learning types, before it was called anything like this. It brought me into the world of machine learning, and so it made me think about learning from data and what you can do with it. And it really prompted me to think about the meaning of all of this, and what is responsible. And just even reflecting here upon, we did all these experiments, but they're on jailbroken phones. So what I just did was redesign the system for jailbroken phones. So it awakened me to many of the issues that come up in responsible AI, but it comes up in, I would call it just responsible automation. Okay. That was the answer you wanted, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. I realized that we are virtually standing between you and the drinks, so we are going to conclude this session. I would like to thank Muffy for this talk. I was really impressed by the topics that you tackled in the presentation, in your research. Really interesting to see as well how more and more you were interested in people.
And I've grown up, yes.
It's very important, and I'm sure